It was just past 6:40 p.m. when the final hymn echoed through the stone walls of St. Augustine's Church. Rain tapped steadily on the arched windows, the kind of soft Appalachian rain that blanketed everything in silence. Inside, 17-year-old Clara Duval stood in the corner of the choir loft, humming the last few bars under her breath. It was a Wednesday evening, like any other. Her robe was neatly folded over her arm. Her satchel hung from the hook in the practice room. Her bike was locked up just outside the back exit, where the alley met the gravel service road. By 7:15, the church caretaker found the lights still on, and Clara was nowhere to be found. Her mother had expected her home by 7:30. Clara always came straight back. She wasn't the type to wander, not on a school night, and never without calling. By 8:05, her phone went to voicemail. At 8:23, her mother drove to the church herself, expecting to find her daughter chatting inside or waiting under the overhang. But what she found instead made her stomach drop. The front doors were locked, the choir lights still glowed through the stained glass windows, and Clara's bike sat under the dripping eaves, untouched, its seat wet, the chain still locked. When police arrived just after 9 p.m., they searched the church first. The pastor had gone home early that day. The janitor, Ed Rowley, said he passed Clara around 6:30 in the side hallway but didn't see her leave. Inside the choir practice room, her sheet music was still open on the stand. Her coat was draped over the chair, her umbrella tucked beside it. Her phone and wallet, though, were missing. That, detectives would later say, suggested she had planned to step out or had been lured out. There were no signs of struggle, nothing knocked over, no screams reported, no scratches or scuff marks. But there was one thing that stood out. The emergency exit at the back of the sanctuary was unlocked. It led to the side alley where the organ repairman often brought in large tools. It wasn't typically used by students, but Clara had been at the church long enough to know her way around. It raised a question detectives couldn't shake. Did she leave through there with someone she trusted? By Thursday morning, Clara's disappearance was headline news in the county. Local officers formed search parties along the nearby riverbank and woods. Bloodhounds were brought in but couldn't pick up a clean scent beyond the parking lot. Drones swept the dense tree line behind the church. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a single piece of clothing. Interviews with her choir classmates painted a familiar picture. Clara was focused, kind, reserved. She stayed after rehearsal often to practice solo pieces. No boyfriend. No arguments. One girl mentioned seeing Clara step into the hallway briefly that night, just after rehearsal ended, just before the storm picked up. She thought Clara might have been heading to the restroom. But when she returned 10 minutes later to grab her forgotten water bottle, Clara was gone. The official timeline stopped cold at 6:45 p.m. The working theory became unnervingly simple. Clara had either chosen to walk away or had gone willingly with someone. Investigators leaned toward the latter. But who? Detectives questioned the choir director, Matthew Stokes, who'd been leading rehearsals that season. He was in his 40s, well-liked, no priors. He'd left just before 7 p.m., said goodbye to Clara on his way out. His car's GPS and security camera footage from the gas station supported his timeline. The janitor was ruled out too. He was mopping the foyer, caught on the church's interior camera until just after 7. That's when something strange came to light. A member of the congregation, an older woman who volunteered with the food pantry, reported hearing footsteps above her coming from the choir loft well past 7:30 that night. She had come by to drop off canned goods in the annex and heard what she described as pacing, slow and rhythmic. At the time, she assumed someone was still practicing, but when she looked upstairs, it was empty. By Friday afternoon, the FBI had been called in. Clara's disappearance had rattled the town. Candlelight vigils gathered outside the school and the chapel. Volunteers combed nearby fields, creek beds, and culverts. Still, the area around St. Augustine's remained eerily quiet. Clara's mother insisted something was wrong. She told anyone who would listen that Clara would never walk off, not in the middle of a storm, not without her coat, not without telling her. But the police pointed to the missing phone, to the absence of physical struggle, to the lack of any digital trail. The rain, they reminded her gently, could have washed away anything that had been there, but those closest to Clara felt it in their gut. Something didn't add up. Something had happened inside that church, and somehow nobody had seen a thing. Because Clara Duval hadn't disappeared into the woods or down a road or through a back door, she disappeared into silence, and it would be 15 years before anyone heard her again. By the second day of Clara's disappearance, the focus had shifted from shock to suspicion. In towns like these, where everyone knew everyone else by name, people didn't just vanish, they were taken, or they left for a reason. That reason became the subject of whispered conversations in coffee shops, behind lockers, between pews. People who once hugged Clara's mother after church were now asking if the girl had been troubled. Had she said anything strange? Was she in love with someone? Did she want to disappear? The police began by circling the people closest to Clara. The choir director, Matthew Stokes, was among the first to be pulled in for formal questioning. He had been the last adult to see her. He'd worked with Clara closely on solos, particularly a piece she was preparing for state auditions. He admitted they had exchanged texts about practice times and vocal ranges, but detectives quickly noticed the tone of those messages. Some were overly casual. One even said, "Beautiful as always." Another read, "You've got a voice that can stop time." Stokes insisted it was harmless, motivational, his way of encouraging a gifted student. But context, tone, and timing made everything feel off. When investigators interviewed former choir members, a few mentioned that Clara had recently started staying after rehearsal more often, sometimes an hour late, sometimes alone with Stokes. One girl claimed she overheard them arguing once in the hallway, something about a song Clara didn't want to perform. That was enough to trigger a deeper look. His phone records, financial history, employment files, everything was put under scrutiny. But there was nothing. No priors, no flagged behavior, no forensic traces tying him to her disappearance. Eventually, reluctantly, he was ruled out. The next wave of suspicion turned toward Clara's peers. In particular, a senior named Reed Wallace. He and Clara had grown up together, and some classmates believed he had feelings for her. There were rumors of jealousy, especially when Clara began texting someone new. Reed was brought in. His phone was clean. His alibi checked out. He was at his grandfather's house playing video games, time-stamped and verified. But he told police something they didn't expect. Clara had been secretive lately, more withdrawn. She was texting someone she didn't talk about, someone she met online. That lead took investigators straight to Clara's phone. Most of her recent messages were routine, choir chats, reminders from teachers, texts to her mom. But in the days before she vanished, there were nearly 40 messages sent to a number not saved in her contacts. All were brief, vague. "I'll check." "Not yet." "Meet after?" "Backstairs." That number, traced by the FBI's cyber unit, belonged to a disposable prepaid phone activated just 1 week earlier. The name used to register, it was fake. The credit card used was a prepaid Visa purchased with cash at a Walmart 30 miles away. The last communication between the two phones was time-stamped at 6:42 p.m. the night Clara disappeared. Then the line went dark, permanently. The phone was never used again. That discovery changed everything. Investigators now believed Clara was communicating with someone she knew only through messages, someone careful, someone deliberate. Her family, though, pushed back. Her mother insisted Clara wasn't the kind of girl who would keep a relationship secret, not from her. She said they were close. They talked about everything, grades, music, even crushes. But there was no mention of a boy, no sign of anxiety, no hidden journal, no behavioral red flags. Still, as the second week dragged on, the questions kept mounting. Why hadn't Clara told anyone? Why the burner phone? Why meet someone in the middle of a rainstorm, without a coat, without a plan, without saying a word? Investigators canvassed electronics stores, Walmart security footage, and any known offenders who had purchased prepaid devices in the months prior. But there was no connection, no camera footage, no receipts. Whoever Clara was speaking to had erased their trail almost perfectly. The working theory began to shift again. Maybe it wasn't a stranger. Maybe it was someone within the community, someone Clara didn't want others to know about, someone who already knew how to stay hidden. The rumors started feeding off that theory. Some thought she'd had an affair with an older man. Others whispered about an unplanned pregnancy. More and more people started believing Clara had left on her own, afraid, ashamed, or manipulated. Her family refused to believe it. They fought every headline, every online thread, every post that painted Clara as reckless or impulsive. Her mother kept pointing to the details: her bike still locked, her robe neatly folded, her phone missing, but no trace of digital clues beyond that burner number. It wasn't a runaway. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had taken Clara, and someone in that church knew how. But with every theory explored and eliminated, every suspect cleared or unreachable, one truth became unbearable. There were no signs of Clara. No noise, no struggle, no clue left behind that made any real sense. And in the absence of answers, people filled the silence with stories. But one story hadn't been told yet, the one hidden in the church itself. For a long time after Clara Duval vanished, the doors of St. Augustine's Church remained closed to the public. Sunday services were temporarily moved to a nearby chapel. Weddings and baptisms were canceled or relocated. The choir program was suspended indefinitely. For months, silence hung inside the stone sanctuary like a fog that wouldn't lift. Every pew, every wall, every corner of the church felt stained by something that couldn't be named. Grief, unease, a wound no one could reach. By early spring, the town tried to return to normal. The bishop ordered the church reopened, gently encouraging the congregation to reclaim their sacred space. The first services were quiet, subdued. A few people wept during hymns. Most just sat still. The choir loft remained empty. No music was played from the organ that once shook the rafters. The pulpit lights were dimmed. The atmosphere was reverent, but strained, almost fearful, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. It was during one of these early services that the church's custodian, Dennis Hale, began to notice odd things. He worked nights, usually after everyone left. One evening, as he swept beneath the choir loft, he heard what he described as soft humming. Not music, not a melody, just a slow, tuneless hum, female, maybe young. He called out. It stopped. He walked up the stairs to the loft, found nothing. Assumed it had been in his head. But the next week, it happened again. This time it was followed by the faint clunk of something metal, like a music stand falling over. Again, no one was there. At first, he told no one, not because he was scared, but because he knew how it would sound. A man hearing voices in a church where a girl had disappeared? No one wanted to believe in ghosts, especially not here, especially not now. But then, other reports surfaced. One parishioner said she heard a chord, just a single breathy note, coming from the organ as she walked past the sanctuary one afternoon. She thought someone was practicing, but the doors were locked and the room was empty. Over the next several months, the claims continued, always faint, always vague. A low G sustained too long, a flicker of vibration under the choir loft floor. A choir robe that had been folded and locked in storage was found slumped over the rail. No one could prove anything. The organ was inspected twice by a technician, once in June, once again in October. Nothing was wrong, nothing mechanical anyway. Some church members believed stress and grief were causing people to imagine things. The emotional weight of Clara's disappearance had never lifted, especially for those who had sung beside her or taught her or knew her family. Trauma, people said, plays tricks on the senses. You want to believe the person is still there. Your mind starts filling in what reality won't give you. Others weren't so sure. Dennis Hale eventually broke his silence. During a conversation with the deacon, he admitted what he'd been hearing. He described the hum in detail, the time of night, the spot on the staircase where it always stopped. He wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to know if anyone else had experienced it. The deacon thanked him, then quietly asked around. And what he heard disturbed him. 2 altar servers claimed they never entered the loft alone anymore. One said the air felt cold up there, even during warm afternoons. Another boy, young, maybe 10, said the organ scared him now. He didn't know why. He just didn't like walking past it. He said once he thought he saw someone sitting behind it. But when he blinked, they were gone. The priest dismissed all of it, grief, imagination, suggestion. He reminded everyone that the church was a place of peace, not fear. And officially, so did law enforcement. Detectives were made aware of the claims but declined to investigate further. They had no evidence, no leads, no person of interest, No new forensics. As far as the department was concerned, the case was still open, but without movement. And so, just past the 1-year mark, Clara Duval's name stopped appearing in the paper. Her photo faded from the bulletin board in the parish hall. The flyers on telephone poles curled and browned in the sun. No more searches were organized, no more candlelight vigils. Her mother still lit one every night in the window, but the community had moved on, at least on the surface. The church continued to hold Mass, though the choir remained unofficially disbanded. A new pastor arrived. The youth programs restarted. A new coat of paint covered the side hallway. But no one volunteered to sit in the choir loft, and the organ, despite still being functional, sat untouched, collecting dust. A quiet understanding formed in the town. Whatever had happened to Clara hadn't happened somewhere far away. It happened here, inside this church, just beyond reach, just out of sight. And even if no one would say it aloud, people had begun to believe something. Some piece of her had never left. Clara's bedroom stayed exactly as it was the night she vanished. Her mother never touched it, not the crumpled sweater on the chair, not the mug with the half-melted candle, not the folder of choir sheet music still marked with pencil. Her robe, deep blue with a frayed collar, hung on the hook behind the door like it might be worn again any minute. The bed was made, one corner slightly rumpled where Clara used to sit and tie her shoes. The lamp stayed on through the night. It had become a silent ritual. Like if the light stayed on, the story hadn't really ended yet. In the weeks that followed, Clara's mother made herself the unofficial center of the search. She gave interviews, answered reporters' calls, printed fresh posters at her own expense, and taped them back up every time the wind took them down. Every few days there was a call. A girl who looked like Clara was seen at a bus stop in Roanoke, a teen matching her description at a shelter 3 counties over. A woman swore she saw Clara walking along a road near the state line, wet hair, blank stare, bare feet. None of them ever turned out to be her. Each one brought a new kind of devastation, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that just sinks. The police stopped calling unless there was something official to share. Most weeks, there wasn't. The town had softened into that strange place between support and distance. People still nodded at her in the grocery store, still brought covered dishes, still folded her into prayer. But they'd stopped asking, because they didn't know what to say anymore, or because they'd quietly decided Clara wasn't coming back. Her mother didn't believe that. I couldn't believe it, not when there were still things that didn't make sense. She began keeping a notebook, not about her daughter's childhood or her favorite meals, but about the church, about what people mentioned in passing but didn't think to write down. She jotted down names of former staff, dates of maintenance logs, strange little details that no one followed up on. One page was dedicated to keys, who had access to which doors, which ones had been replaced, which were missing. Another tracked the church's sound system, where the old speaker lines ran, which ones connected to the organ console when the last repairs were done. Some of the entries were more personal. One night she wrote down something a woman said after a service, that her son had come home talking about how the choir loft creaked when no one was up there. Another time, she made a note after seeing fresh footprints in the dust along the back hallway, small, narrow ones, like Clara's. The janitor dismissed it as someone passing through after a rehearsal, but the choir hadn't met in months. The problem was, no one listened anymore. The detective assigned to the case changed departments. The new one was polite, professional, but he saw the grief as an obsession. Every time she called with a new theory, he asked if she'd spoken to someone, a counselor, a pastor, anyone who could help her accept what they couldn't prove. But she didn't want help accepting. She wanted someone to keep looking. She started walking to the church alone, sitting in the back pew, watching the space, listening. She began to notice little things no one else did. The temperature near the organ was colder. The dust near the choir risers never settled right. One morning, just before dawn, she slipped inside while the door was being propped open for deliveries. She climbed the steps to the loft and stood where Clara used to stand. The robe rack beside the organ console still had an empty hanger. That shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. She wasn't the only one haunted. Clara's best friend, Julie, who had moved away after graduation, sent a message out of the blue. She wrote that something felt wrong about the way things had ended. She remembered Clara saying she didn't like practicing alone anymore, that someone had been making her uncomfortable. When asked who, Julie couldn't remember or wouldn't say. It was just a feeling. The notebook thickened with pages. But without a badge or a warrant or access to the building logs, there was nowhere for it to go. It was just one mother, alone, collecting pieces no one else believed were part of anything. And still, the room stayed untouched. Every night she passed the doorway, glanced in, and waited. Because something in her wouldn't let go of the idea that Clara hadn't left on her own. And if the church held answers, no one was looking in the right place. 15 years had passed, but in many ways, the town of Marion still felt like it had never moved on. Life had filled in around the absence, new families, new pastors, new paint on old buildings. But the silence at the heart of St. Augustine's church never really went away. The choir loft had remained empty. The organ is untouched. Clara's name is unspoken in official sermons. For years it had stayed that way, until the town's 150th anniversary committee announced they were bringing the past back to life, literally. The old church was being renovated, and with it, the choir would return for one commemorative performance. One night only, for tradition, for healing, for closure. They reached out to former choir members, those who had sung there before Clara vanished. A few declined, some never responded, but among those who said yes was Julie Morrison, Clara's closest friend. She hadn't stepped inside that church since graduation, hadn't sung publicly since. She taught 3rd grade now, lived 2 towns over, had a husband and a daughter of her own. But when the letter came, she didn't hesitate. She said yes, even though the thought of returning twisted something deep in her chest. The church looked cleaner now, brighter. New windows had been installed, the floors refinished, the pews restained. The organ, long silent, was being repaired by a specialist brought in from out of state. It was a massive job, over 1,000 pipes, many of them original to the church's founding in 1904. But none of the changes could erase what had happened there, not really. When Julie stepped into the sanctuary for the first rehearsal, the smell of the wood, the way the light angled across the altar, even the soft echo of her shoes on the tile, it all brought her straight back to that night. The others arrived slowly. Some greeted one another with cautious hugs, others sat quietly, not sure what to say after so many years. Most of them hadn't spoken since the last time they sang together, and none of them mentioned Clara. Not at first. The choir director for the event, a younger woman from a neighboring church, had never known Clara. She handed out new arrangements, cheerful and efficient. But when she asked Julie to lead a solo, Ave Verum Corpus, the same piece Clara had been rehearsing the night she vanished, Julie froze. For a moment she considered walking out, but something inside her said no. Not this time. The first time they ran through it, the notes felt heavy. Everyone was slightly off. Voices cracked, timing slipped. No one mentioned why, but every person in that room felt it, like the sound was struggling to settle, like the space was resisting. Julie couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not visually, but in the way the church responded. The acoustics felt strange, muted in places they hadn't been before, sharper in others. It was subtle, but undeniable. She brought it up to the organ technician during a break. He brushed it off. Humidity, maybe. The new finish on the walls, air pressure changes, but his tone wavered when she pressed further. Eventually, he admitted he'd noticed something odd, too. One of the lower ranks of pipes was producing a fluttering vibration, even when not in use. Not constant, but just enough to raise questions. He said it might be a loose valve. Maybe something had fallen inside one of the deeper pipes. A nesting bird, perhaps. Rodents. Debris. He'd look into it more before the final tuning, but when Julie asked him how long it had been acting that way, he said he wasn't sure. It had started as soon as he began cleaning out the inner pipe chambers. He hadn't even reached the lowest tier yet. Some of the pipes hadn't been opened in decades. That night, Julie couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about how Clara had hated that organ. Not the music, but the sound of it, the vibration it sent through the floorboards, the way it seemed to surround you instead of staying where it belonged. She used to joke that it could swallow a voice whole. Julie had always thought that was just nerves. But now, standing there again, she wondered if Clara had felt something even back then, something no one else had heard. The next day's rehearsal went smoother, but the unease lingered. Afterward, Julie stayed behind. She climbed the stairs to the choir loft alone, the same way they used to after practice, the same way Clara had, the night she never came back down. The organ loomed behind her, towering and intricate. Its pipes reached toward the ceiling, hundreds of them, some small enough to fit in a palm, others large enough to crawl inside. She stood there, eyes closed, and listened. And for a moment, just a second, she thought she heard something behind the tone of the wind outside. A note, one single breathless tone, not played, not mechanical, something trapped, something waiting. She told herself it was nothing, that it had to be the draft or her own breath, or memory. But she left the loft shaken, because even after all these years, the church didn't feel like it had healed. It felt like it was holding something in. The organ technician's name was Harold Tinsley. He'd been restoring church instruments for over 30 years, working on cathedrals, abbeys, and small-town chapels across the southeast. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in local legends. What he did believe in was airflow, reed alignment, and the unmistakable sound of something not quite right. It happened on a Thursday, just before noon. He'd spent the morning calibrating the tracker action, crawling behind the massive wooden console, adjusting wind pressure from the 1904 blower system. The pipes were old but not in bad shape, some grime, a few cobwebs, nothing out of the ordinary. Until he tested the 16-foot Borden in the lower rank. That pipe wasn't just off, it was wrong. When he pushed the note, the tone came out warped, fluttery, with a strange, uneven resonance. It wavered in the middle, almost like two notes trying to play at once. He pressed it again. Same sound. It wasn't an air leak. He checked the valve, he checked the tow hole, everything was sealed. That left one possibility. Something was stuck inside. His assistant suggested a bird, maybe nesting material. Squirrels were known to crawl inside older pipes. Tinsley had seen it all: dead mice, paper scraps, once even a child's toy jammed in the swell box of a church in Tennessee. Usually, the debris gathered near the mouth where it could be dislodged easily. But this one was lodged deeper, well past the tuning cap. He tried a flexible grabber first. Nothing. Then, he slid a weighted probe down, hoping to feel the obstruction. It stopped abruptly, about 3 feet down. The blockage wasn't metal. It wasn't wood. It gave just slightly, then resisted. That's when he brought out the borescope. The probe slid down slowly, the camera feeding back live video on a small screen. For a while, it was just the inside of the pipe. Dull gray metal, dust, spider threads. Then, something shifted in the light. Fabric. At first, it looked like old insulation, a strip of decayed burlap or felt, but it had a pattern, a rhythm. The folds were too uniform, and the texture didn't match anything from the organ's construction. It wasn't padding. It was cloth. He adjusted the light, steadied the probe. The image became clearer. A blue garment, torn but still recognizable. It clung to something underneath, something rounded, something still. Tinsley didn't panic. He didn't even speak for a moment. He just stared at the screen, trying to match what he saw with any rational explanation. He couldn't. He stepped back, his hands shaking now. He told his assistant to stop the calibration. Something was wrong. Within an hour, the church was empty. Police were called. The choir rehearsals were suspended. Tinsley stayed behind to explain what he'd found, where, how deep, how long it may have been there. The officers didn't dismiss him. Not this time. They'd heard the rumors. They'd seen the headlines all those years ago. And now, there was physical evidence inside the one place no one had ever thought to search. A cavity in plain sight, sealed by design. They cordoned off the sanctuary. Tinsley was asked to assist but not interfere. Forensics arrived the next morning. A full extraction would take time. The pipe couldn't be dismantled easily. It was mounted high, built into the original casing, and removal risked damaging the entire array. But they worked slowly, methodically. When the borescope was inserted again, under controlled conditions, the footage confirmed what Tinsley feared. The cloth wasn't random. It was a choir robe, dark blue, faded by time, but still intact enough to see the stitch pattern, identical to the robes worn by the choir in 2010. The silence that followed that discovery wasn't just shock. It was a realization. After 15 years, after all the theories and whispers, after every dead lead and false sighting, Clara Duval had never left the church. She had been inside it the entire time. What no one could explain was how, or why, or who knew. But one thing had just become certain. The organ's strange vibration wasn't mechanical. It was a warning. It took nearly a full day to dismantle the section of pipe where the fabric had been discovered. The casing was original, hand-forged metal, soldered seams, riveted into place during the church's earliest years. The forensic team worked slowly, careful not to disturb what might be inside. A ladder was brought in, the organ console was covered. The sanctuary was silent, except for the sound of tools tapping against steel. No congregation was allowed in. The choir loft was sealed off. By mid-afternoon, the pipe was lowered carefully from its brackets and laid onto a padded surface across the altar steps. When they opened it, the smell came first. Not overwhelming, but unmistakable, like mildew, decay, and something older, something dry. They unrolled the cloth gently. It didn't fall apart like they expected. The fabric had weathered the years surprisingly well, folded in on itself like it had been tucked there, deliberately. What lay beneath was small, disjointed, quiet. Bone fragments, a broken rosary, its chain rusted in several places, a single molar with a gold filling. The technicians didn't say anything. They just started taking photographs. The church was shut down that evening. Services were canceled. A formal statement was issued. An unidentified set of remains had been discovered during the renovation. No names, no speculation. But no one needed confirmation. Everyone already knew. For those who remembered the search, who remembered the night Clara Duval vanished after choir rehearsal, there was no doubt who had been found. The remains were transported to the county coroner's office under full evidence chain of custody. The bones were partial, severe decomposition, and the pressure inside the pipe had limited what could be recovered, but there was enough. The molar was the key. Dental records from 2010 confirmed the filling matched Clara's last documented dental work. Weeks later, the DNA test came back as conclusive. The body inside the pipe was hers. Clara Duval had been in the church the entire time. Her mother was notified in person. She didn't cry at first. She just sat down slowly on the couch and stared at the floor. When asked if she wanted to see the remains, she nodded once, then changed her mind. She said she already had a picture in her head, one she'd lived with for 15 years, and she didn't want to replace it. But she did ask to see the robe, just the robe. They let her. She recognized it immediately. It had been hemmed by her own hands. The town didn't know how to react. Some people were relieved, others were horrified. The idea that the organ, a sacred instrument, played for weddings, for baptisms, for funerals, had hidden a body all those years felt impossible to process. That so many prayers had passed through the pipes that held her, that so many people had been so close without knowing. Rumors started again. People wondered how it could have been missed. Whether anyone had helped cover it up, whether it had really been an accident at all. But there were no answers yet. No cameras inside the loft, no fingerprints left after all that time, no clear sign of how she had gotten in, or who had put her there. All investigators knew for certain was that the pipe's opening had been high off the ground, far too narrow to access without tools, and positioned in a part of the organ not easily reached from inside. It would have taken planning, strength, familiarity with the instrument's structure, and time. Whoever had done it hadn't panicked. They'd concealed her carefully, deliberately. That narrowed the list of people with access. With knowledge, with motive, and with silence. Detectives reopened the case officially, this time as a confirmed homicide. New forensics was ordered. Every surviving maintenance log was reviewed. Everyone who had worked on the organ, volunteered in the loft, or held keys to the choir rooms in 2010 was contacted. Many were elderly now. Some had passed. Some claimed not to remember. Others simply said they'd stopped thinking about it years ago. But the case wasn't quiet anymore. Because now there were remains. Now there was proof. And now there was only one question left. Who put Clara Duval inside that pipe? With Clara's remains confirmed and the public in stunned disbelief, the case, long dormant, was reopened with urgency. But this time, It wasn't treated as a missing persons case. It was a homicide. The shift in classification brought new eyes, fresh resources, and federal-level assistance. The organ pipe where her body had been hidden was now considered a primary crime scene, and forensic attention turned toward the details that had once been overlooked. That included everything about the organ itself, its layout, its structure, and more importantly, who would have known how to use it to hide a body. Investigators started with the basics. The pipe in question had been sealed from both ends, with its opening bolted beneath a wooden casing that required specialized tools to access. Clara couldn't have gotten inside it alone, not without help, and certainly not without being noticed. The weight distribution inside the pipe confirmed she'd been placed there gently, carefully, likely while unconscious, or worse. The inner space was narrow and curved. Whoever had hidden her inside had known exactly how to navigate the chamber. That detail, according to the organ specialist assisting the investigation, narrowed the suspect pool drastically. Only someone familiar with the internal mechanics would have known it was even possible. That's when they revisited the church's renovation logs from 2010. Amid the documents, receipts, and contracts, a maintenance request stood out, filed just weeks before Clara vanished. It involved minor tuning, internal valve adjustments, and cleaning of the lower wind chest. The technician listed wasn't part of the official church staff. He was a local volunteer, brought in as a favor through an acquaintance of the choir director. His name wasn't mentioned in any original investigation records. No one had flagged him. At the time, there had been no reason to. His name was Daniel Royce. He wasn't from Marion. He'd come from a small town 30 miles away, known for helping churches restore aging instruments. A hobbyist more than a professional, he held no licenses, but had a reputation for being meticulous. According to the archived emails, he'd been inside the church for 2 full days during the second week of October 2010. He'd worked alone. No background check had been conducted. No follow-up. After Clara vanished just 2 weeks later, Royce never returned. By December, he'd moved out of state. A request was made for latent prints inside the pipe. Originally, the organ's surfaces had been assumed too old, too degraded, and too contaminated for viable prints. But the interior panel, specifically the underside of a locking bracket, had been protected from airflow and light. Investigators had preserved it during removal. A partial fingerprint had been recovered, smudged, but enough for a match. When the print came back, it confirmed what detectives now feared. It belonged to Daniel Royce. The match wasn't perfect. It wasn't the kind that held up alone in court, but it placed him inside the exact compartment where Clara's body had been hidden. That was enough to trigger a search warrant. By the time authorities located Royce, he was living in rural Kentucky under a slightly altered name, Dan R. Owens. He'd never been arrested, had no criminal record. Lived alone in a small house near the edge of town and worked as a part-time piano tuner. Quiet, polite, cooperative. He claimed he remembered working on the organ, but denied any knowledge of Clara Duval or her disappearance. When shown photos of her from the choir days, he didn't react. Claimed he'd never seen her before, but when confronted with the fingerprint match, his demeanor changed. Don't panic, not anger, just stillness. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He asked for a lawyer. What followed was weeks of interviews, forensic retesting, and the start of what would become one of the most chilling investigations the town had seen in decades. Detectives began combing through Royce's past, church to church, repair log to repair log. Most locations reported no issues, no missing persons, no complaints. But one entry raised a flag, an anonymous note in a church in Georgia years earlier, referencing a strange man who lingered after services. Nothing ever came of it, until now. Royce remained in custody. Official charges were being prepared. But even before his confession, before any trial or defense, there was one fact that could no longer be denied. The man who repaired the organ in 2010 had returned weeks later and left Clara Duval behind, sealed inside it. Daniel Royce didn't fight the arrest. When agents arrived at his Kentucky home, he opened the door quietly, hands already outstretched as if he had been expecting them. The house was small, the lawn unkempt. Inside, it was meticulously clean. Books lined in perfect order, shelves of organ manuals, boxes of worn sheet music. In the basement, they found something else. Dozens of envelopes, each marked with a year and the name of a church. Most were harmless: programs, attendance records, tuning receipts. But one box marked Marion 2010 changed everything. Inside were photographs, not many, but enough. They were small, printed on cheap paper, and most of them were angled oddly, taken from behind corners, through door frames, from the shadows of the loft. A few were of the choir mid-rehearsal, indistinct and blurry, but several focused on Clara Duval. In one, she's sitting alone at the piano, head tilted down. In another, she's adjusting her choir robe in the hallway. The final image is the most unsettling. Clara standing near the rear staircase, facing away from the camera, her silhouette partially obscured by the shadow of the organ pipes. Royce didn't speak for the first 3 days. When he finally agreed to talk, he didn't cry. He didn't offer excuses. His voice was quiet, controlled. He said he didn't mean for it to happen, that he just wanted to talk to her, that he saw something in her, something pure. He claimed she reminded him of someone from his past, though he never said who. On the night of her disappearance, he said he asked her for help, told her he'd left a tool behind the organ console, just a quick favor. She followed him upstairs. She never came back down. Royce didn't go into detail. He wouldn't describe what happened after, only that it got out of hand. He said he panicked, that he didn't know what to do, but even as he said it, investigators knew he had. He'd known exactly what to do. He had used the tuning panel in the back of the bourdon pipe, an access route he himself had cleaned 2 weeks prior. He had removed a section of paneling, folded Clara's body carefully, and lowered her into the chamber. Then he reattached the panel, resealed it, and walked away. It was methodical, intentional, deliberate. When asked why he never came forward, why he didn't leave a note, call the police, say something, anything, he simply said, "The music was all I had left." He claimed he returned to churches not to relive what happened, but to keep it quiet. He said it was penance, that he volunteered not to hide, but to preserve the thing he had taken from her, her voice, her gift. He believed, in his own distorted way, that he was honoring her, but investigators didn't see it that way. They saw obsession. In Royce's home, they found maps. A list of churches where Clara's choir had performed, program notes with her name circled in ink, recordings from concerts she'd sung in as a child. He had followed her well before he ever introduced himself. The night he approached her at St. Augustine's wasn't the first time he saw her. It was the moment he'd been planning for. The case, once unsolved for 15 years, moved rapidly now. The DA prepared charges: kidnapping, unlawful confinement, manslaughter. There wasn't enough evidence for first-degree murder. Too much time had passed, too much decomposition. But there was enough to ensure Royce would never walk free again. When Clara's mother was informed of the full confession, she didn't want to hear it, not at first. Then, later, she asked to read the transcripts alone. She spent 2 hours in a quiet room at the station. When she emerged, she said only one thing. He took her from the world, then kept pretending he hadn't. For the town, the final puzzle piece left a scar that would never fully heal. The organ was removed from St. Augustine's, every pipe, every panel, gone. The choir never reformed. No music played inside that sanctuary again. The man who called it "keeping the music alive" had used it as cover. But the music hadn't honored Clara. It had buried her. It was early spring when Clara Duval was finally laid to rest. Not in the cemetery up the hill where her father had once reserved a family plot, but within the sanctuary of St. Augustine's itself, the same church she had sung in, grown up in, vanished from. Her casket was small, not because of her size, but because 15 years in a sealed pipe had left so little behind. The service wasn't open to the public, but nearly the whole town came anyway. Some stood at the doors, others lined the sidewalk. No one said they were there to gawk. They said they came to listen, to be quiet, to try and understand. Clara's mother sat in the front row, her hands wrapped around the faded blue ribbon of her daughter's old choir medal. She didn't speak during the service. Didn't look around. She kept her eyes fixed on the altar and didn't let go of the ribbon once. The pew beside her was left empty, per her request. For Clara, she said, just in case her spirit hadn't made it out yet. The organ sat silent. After the investigation concluded, engineers had permanently disabled it. The pipe that held Clara was removed entirely, the cavity sealed with a brass plate engraved only with the date of her recovery. No music played during the ceremony, no hymns, no piano, no choir, just the sound of breath and footsteps and grief. A pastor from out of town gave the eulogy, one who hadn't known Clara but had read everything there was to read. He didn't talk about justice, he didn't use words like closure. He talked about stillness, about the unbearable weight of silence, and about the way places, buildings, walls, instruments, carry memory whether we want them to or not. He said the sanctuary would never sound the same again, and everyone in that room already knew it was true. What haunted people most wasn't just where Clara had been hidden. It was how close she had remained, how many times the organ had been played, how many services had filled that sanctuary with joy and sorrow and faith while she was trapped just feet away. Every baptism, every Christmas cantata, every funeral solo. Her voice was gone, but the music continued. As if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't still been there, buried inside the very thing that made those songs possible. For some, that realization shattered their connection to the church entirely. Attendance dropped. Donations fell. Some families moved to other congregations. Others stopped going altogether. St. Augustine's didn't close, but it didn't thrive. It became quieter. The choir loft was never used again. The pews near the front, once filled with children, were now always half empty. But for Clara's mother, that place became something else. Not haunted, not sacred, just honest. She visited weekly, not to pray, but to sit, to listen, to remember. The brass plate in the pipe chamber became her daughter's headstone. No flowers were left there, no candles, just the weight of truth. Julie Morrison returned once, years later, on the anniversary of the funeral. She sat alone in the choir loft. She told no one she was coming. She brought no music, just herself. She looked down at the altar, at the empty bench where Clara used to sit. Then she looked at the new seal on the organ, the one that marked where Clara's voice had been taken and where her silence had lived. Julie didn't cry, but when she left, she didn't look back. The town of Marion would talk about Clara's case for generations, how she vanished, how she was found, how she was hidden in plain sight. But what most people would never say aloud, what stuck in their throats and trembled behind their silence, was the quiet horror of realizing that they had kept playing. I kept singing, kept worshiping, right through her. The music had never stopped, and now it never would sound the same again.